The void of deep space is silent, but inside the hull of the GSV Stellaris, the tension was loud enough to vibrate in Leo's marrow. He had been a cultural liaison for exactly 6 weeks, which was just long enough to realize that being the only human on a ship full of Xandarian warriors was like being a golden retriever in a room full of sentient obsidian statues. Leo knew the stakes. One wrong move wasn't just a social gaffe. It was a potential interplanetary crisis. He'd already learned that laughing at a Xandarian's height was a death wish, and that their protein shakes tasted suspiciously like industrial coolant. But nothing in his 3 years of intensive xenobiology training had prepared him for the internal catastrophe currently unfolding in the secondary mess hall. It started with a sensor calibration. Or rather, a lack of one. Leo was supposed to be documenting the physiological markers of the Xandarian leadership to better understand their nonverbal cues. His subject was Commander Vora, a 6'4" powerhouse of iridescent scales and lethal grace. To any other species, she was a terrifying vision of martial perfection. To Leo, she was a walking enigma of biological data. He had his digital datapad out, surreptitiously scanning, his eyes darting between the screen and the commander's lower torso, where her primary power cell belt was fastened. He was looking for the subtle rhythmic pulsing of her secondary respiratory vents, located just above the hip. At least, that's what he told himself. Hold on before we get into the real stuff, I want to know. What are you doing at this exact moment while hearing my voice? I love seeing your answers down below in the comments. As Leo adjusted the zoom on his ocular implant, he didn't notice the room go quiet. He didn't notice the other Xandarian officers stepping back with looks of amused horror. He was too focused on the data, too focused on the way her scales shifted like liquid mercury. He was so deep in his scientific observation that he didn't realize Commander Vora had stopped talking. She didn't turn around immediately. Instead, she let the silence stretch, a heavy, suffocating blanket of quiet that finally made the hair on the back of Leo's neck stand up. Slowly, with a predatory smoothness that made Leo's heart skip a beat, Vora spun on her heel. Her golden eyes, slit like a reptile's but burning with a very human-like intensity, locked onto his. Leo froze. His datapad was still pointed directly at her waistline. He felt the blood drain from his face as the realization hit him. From any outside perspective, he wasn't conducting a biological survey. He was staring, intently, blatantly. Vora crossed her massive, armored arms over her chest. The metal of her bracers clinked, a sound like a hammer hitting an anvil. The air in the mess hall seemed to drop 10 degrees. Leo tried to swallow, but his throat was a desert. He opened his mouth to explain, to apologize, to scream, but no sound came out. He was paralyzed by the sheer dominance of her presence. The commander took one step forward, her heavy boots thudding against the deck plating. She leaned down, her face inches from his, the scent of ozone and strange spices filling his lungs. A smirk tugged at the corner of her mouth, though her eyes remained dangerously sharp. "Tell me, Terran," she purred, her voice a low rumble that vibrated in Leo's chest. "Is there a specific reason you have spent the last 3 minutes intensely inspecting my posterior? Or should I be calling for a security detail to escort you to the brig?" Leo's mind went completely blank. The scientific explanation about respiratory vents felt incredibly flimsy in the face of her blunt accusation. He looked at the datapad, then back at her, then at the crowded room of aliens who were now all waiting for his answer. The fate of Earth's diplomatic standing on the Stellaris rested on his next 5 words, and all he could think about was how much trouble he was actually in. The silence in the mess hall wasn't just quiet. It was a physical weight, pressing against Leo's eardrums until he thought they might pop. He could feel the heat radiating from Commander Vora's iridescent scales, a biological warning sign he'd read about in manuals, but never expected to experience at point-blank range. Her golden eyes weren't blinking. Xandarians only blinked when they were bored, and right now, Vora looked like she was witnessing the most entertaining disaster of her career. I was... The respiratory vents, Leo stammered, his voice cracking in a way that would have been humiliating in high school, and was downright suicidal in front of a galactic war hero. He held up his datapad like a shield, the screen still flickering with thermal heat maps of her lower torso. Commander, I assure you, it's purely for the Cultural Exchange Archive. The way your species regulates core temperature through the posterior lateral vents it's a marvel of evolution. Vora didn't move, she didn't blink. She just tilted her head slightly, a gesture that reminded Leo of a raptor deciding which part of its prey to eat first. A low, guttural chortle erupted from the back of the room. Lieutenant Krell, a massive Xandarian with a scar running across his snout, was clearly enjoying the human's discomfort. The tension spiked. If the crew thought Leo was a pervert, his career was over. If they thought he was lying to cover it up, he'd be lucky to be exchanged back to Earth in one piece. A marvel of evolution? Vora repeated, her voice dropping an octave into a dangerous, silken register. She took a half-step closer, forcing Leo to crane his neck back. So, you weren't admiring the craftsmanship of my ceremonial armor? Or perhaps the sturdiness of my frame, as your captain so tactfully put it during the gala? Leo felt the sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. No. I mean, yes, your armor is magnificent, but no, I was looking at the biological pulsing. It's a rhythmic indicator of stress levels. I was trying to see if the recent engine vibrations were affecting the crew's equilibrium. It was a lie, or at least a very polished version of the truth. He had been curious about the vents, but he'd also been distracted by the sheer, imposing presence of the woman standing before him. Vora's gaze drifted down to the datapad in his shaking hands. She reached out, her clawed fingers brushing against his knuckles as she took the device from him. Leo's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. She swiped through the data logs, her eyes narrowing as she processed the complex Terran biometrics he'd been recording. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound was the hum of the ship's life support. Then, the corners of her mouth curled upward. Not into a smirk, but into a genuine, terrifyingly sharp-toothed grin. She handed the datapad back, her fingers lingering on his for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. The heat in Leo's face reached a boiling point. "Your data is accurate, Liaison Leo," she said, her voice carrying across the silent mess hall. "My vents were pulsing at an accelerated rate. But it wasn't the engine vibrations that caused the spike." She leaned in, her breath smelling of rare earth minerals and ozone, whispering just loud enough for him to hear. "It was the fact that I knew exactly what you were doing from the moment you walked in. We Xandarians have sensory patches on our posterior, as you call it. I felt your gaze like a physical touch." Leo felt his knees go weak. He had just been caught touching a high-ranking alien commander with his eyes, and she had let him do it for 3 minutes. The power dynamic shifted instantly. He wasn't the scientist observing a subject anymore. He was a mouse that had been allowed to play with the cat's whiskers. Vora turned back to her crew, her cape swishing with a predatory flare. "The human is observant," she announced, her voice booming. Perhaps too observant for his own safety. She looked back at Leo, her eyes flashing with a spark of something he couldn't quite identify. Was it amusement or a challenge? "Since you are so interested in my biological markers, Leo, you'll accompany me to the training deck. I have a feeling your research requires a much closer look at how a Xandarian moves under pressure." The mess hall erupted into a chorus of rhythmic, tail-thumping, the Xandarian version of a standing ovation. Leo stood there, clutching his datapad, realizing he had just been invited to a session that would likely involve him being tossed around a gym by a woman who could bench press a rover. He had survived the confrontation, but as Vora walked away, she threw one last look over her shoulder that made his blood run cold. "And Leo," she called out, "next time you want to check my temperature, just ask. I might even let you use a thermometer." The room roared with laughter, and Leo realized with a sinking feeling that his reputation as a professional diplomat was gone, replaced by something much more complicated. He was no longer just the human liaison. He was the human who had stared, and Vora wasn't finished with him yet. Not by a long shot. The training deck of the Stellaris smelled like ionized air and old sweat, a combination that made Leo's human nostrils twitch. He stood at the edge of the circular combat mat, clutching his datapad like a holy relic. Around him, Xandarian soldiers were sparring with a ferocity that looked less like practice and more like a blood feud. Scales clashed against scales, and the dull thuds of heavy limbs hitting padded floors echoed through the vaulted chamber. In the center of it all stood Commander Vora. She had stripped down to her gray undersuit, a skin-tight kinetic weave that left very little to the imagination, and certainly left her respiratory vents completely unobstructed. Leo's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He was supposed to be collecting data, but every time Vora moved, his brain seemed to short-circuit. She was a master of efficiency. Every strike was calculated, every dodge a masterpiece of physics. "Are you recording, liaison?" Vora's voice cut through the cacophony of the gym. She didn't look at him as she parried a practice blade from a soldier twice Leo's size. With a fluid twist of her hips, the very area Leo had been studying, she sent the giant sprawling. "Every millisecond, Commander," Leo managed to squeak out. He adjusted the settings on his lens, trying to focus on the biomechanics of her footwork. But his hands were shaking. He could feel the eyes of every soldier in the room on him. To them, he was a curious pet. To Vora, he was a puzzle she hadn't finished solving. Vora dismissed her sparring partner with a curt nod and stepped off the mat, walking directly toward Leo. As she approached, the infrared sensors on his datapad began to flare. Her body temperature was skyrocketing, and those vents he had been so obsessed with were now pulsing with a visible, rhythmic intensity. They glowed a soft bioluminescent blue, signaling her body was purging excess heat from the exertion. It was beautiful, in a terrifying, alien sort of way. "You look pale, Terran," she remarked, stopping just inches from him. A bead of blue-tinted sweat rolled down her temple. "Is the atmosphere in here too thin for your fragile lungs? Or is it the sight of Xandarian blood pumping that unnerves you?" "Neither," Leo lied, his eyes fixed firmly on her face this time. "I'm just processing the sheer output of energy. Your species is 40% more efficient at thermoregulation than the manual suggested. If I can document this correctly, it could change how we design environmental suits for joint missions." Vora's eyes narrowed, a glint of genuine curiosity flickering in the gold. "You truly are obsessed with how I function, aren't you? It isn't just the posterior gaze. You want to know what makes me tick." She reached out, her large, warm hand closing around the top of his datapad, tilting it down so he was forced to look at her, not the screen. "But data is cold, Leo. It doesn't tell you how a Xandarian feels when the heat builds up." The air between them felt thick enough to swim in. Leo realized then that this wasn't just a reprimand for his staring in the mess hall. This was a test of his resolve. She was pushing him, waiting to see if the human would break or if he would lean into the chaos. "I prefer the heat to the cold," Leo said, his voice regaining some of its lost confidence. "And I think your function is the most fascinating thing on this ship." Vora let out a low, vibrating hum, a sound Leo recognized as approval. But before he could feel a sense of victory, the ship's internal alarms began to wail. A deep, soul-shaking groan vibrated through the floorboards, and the gravity plating flickered. For a split second, they were weightless. Leo's feet left the floor, and instinctively, he grabbed onto the nearest solid object. That object happened to be Vora's shoulders. As the gravity slammed back into place, he fell forward, pinning her against the equipment rack. His face was buried in the crook of her neck, right against the searing heat of her primary heat vent. He froze, his breath hitching. He was touching a commander. He was touching the most dangerous woman in the sector. And then, he felt her hands grip his waist, pulling him even closer instead of pushing him away. "Liaison," she whispered, her voice rough with a sudden sharp edge. The ship just dropped out of warp. And we aren't in Federation space anymore. The gravity on the Stellaris surged back with a vengeance, slamming Leo's boots into the deck plating. He was still chest to chest with Commander Vora, his hands white-knuckled against her shoulders. The heat radiating from her skin was intense, a dry, desert-like warmth that seemed to seep through his regulation jumpsuit. For a split second, the sirens and the flashing red emergency lights faded into the background. All Leo could hear was the rapid, rhythmic thrum of Vora's secondary heart against his own ribs. "Liaison," Vora growled, though her grip on his waist didn't loosen immediately. "As much as I appreciate your sudden enthusiasm for Xandarian biology, we have a localized reality collapse to deal with." Leo scrambled backward, nearly tripping over his own feet. His face was burning hot, likely matching the thermal signature of Vora's vents. "I apologize, Commander. Gravity flux. Law of physics. I didn't mean to." "Save it for the report," she interrupted, already turning toward the nearest station. Her movements were no longer fluid and teasing. They were sharp, military, and lethal. She punched a sequence into the holo-projected interface. "Bridge, this is Vora. Report status." "Why are we in a dead zone?" The voice that crackled back was distorted by static, heavy with the sound of panicked clicking, the linguistic markers of the insectoid navigation officer. "Commander. Spatial rift. Unmapped. We've been pulled into the Draxian fringe. Engines are cold. Weapon systems are dark." Leo felt a cold pit form in his stomach. The Draxian fringe was no man's land in the most literal sense. It was a graveyard of ships that had strayed too close to the Galactic core's unstable folds. No one ever came back from the fringe. Vora looked at Leo, her golden eyes reflecting the strobing red of the alarm lights. The playfulness from the training deck was gone, replaced by the cold calculation of a veteran who had seen 1,000 ways to die in the dark. "You're the Cultural Liaison," she said, her voice dropping to a low, commanding register. "The Draxians aren't just scavengers. They're territorial predators. If they find us drifting, they won't ask for our credentials. They'll dismantle this ship for the raw carbon." I've studied their dialects," Leo said, trying to steady his breathing. "But they haven't communicated with the Federation in 60 years. They consider staring a declaration of war, and smiling an admission of weakness." Vora stepped closer, her towering frame casting a long shadow over him. "Then it's a good thing you've had so much practice staring at things you shouldn't, isn't it?" She reached out and tapped his datapad. "Keep that thing recording. Every energy signature, every vibration. If we're going to survive the fringe, I need to know exactly how much pressure this ship and you can take." Suddenly, the Stellaris groaned again, a sound like grinding metal echoing through the hull. A massive shadow began to blot out the stars on the viewing monitors. It wasn't a planet. It was a ship, jagged, asymmetrical, and bristling with harpoon-like docking clamps. "They're here," Leo whispered, his pulse skyrocketing. Vora grabbed a heavy pulse rifle from the rack, checking the charge with a practiced flick of her wrist. She looked at Leo, a grim, predatory smile touching her lips. "Stay behind me, Terran. And for the love of your small, fragile gods, try to keep your eyes on the enemy this time." But as the docking clamps of the Draxian vessel slammed into the hull with a bone-jarring thud, Leo realized something terrifying. The sensors on his datapad weren't picking up biological life from the boarding craft. They were picking up something much, much older. The screech of metal on metal was like a physical blow, a sound that bypassed the ears and vibrated straight into the teeth. Leo's datapad flickered wildly, the screen bleeding into static before snapping back to a high-contrast thermal overlay. He stared at the readout, his breath hitching in his chest. The boarding craft wasn't filled with the warm, erratic signatures of Draxian scavengers. It was cold, dead cold, with only the rhythmic mechanical pulse of ancient fusion cores. "Vora, wait!" Leo shouted over the rising hiss of atmospheric venting. "The sensors, they aren't organic. These aren't Draxians. Not living ones anyway. Commander Vora paused, her finger hovering over the trigger of her pulse rifle. She looked at the heavy blast doors of the training deck, which were already beginning to glow cherry red at the seams. "Explain, Terran, quickly, before the hull is breached." "It's an automated salvage drone swarm," Leo said, his fingers flying across the datapad to recalibrate the sensors. "Leftover relics from the Great Schism. They don't recognize life signs. They only recognize salvageable materials. To them, this ship is just a heap of refined alloys, and we're the infestation inside it." Vora's iridescent scales shifted to a dull stony gray, a Xandarian sign of extreme battle focus. "If they don't recognize life, they won't stop until the atmosphere is gone and the hull is stripped." "Can we talk to them?" "They're pre-programmed," Leo replied, his heart hammering. "Logic gates only, but I can try to spoof our signature. If I can convince their central processor that the Stellaris is a hazardous waste vessel, they might back off." The blast doors groaned, the metal buckling inward as a diamond-tipped drill bit punched through the center. Sparks showered the floor, and the air began to whistle as it was sucked toward the vacuum. Vora grabbed Leo by the back of his tactical vest, hauling him behind a reinforced equipment crate, just as the door exploded into 1,000 jagged shrapnel fragments. Through the smoke, a spindly, multi-limbed machine skittered into the room. It looked like a skeletal spider made of rusted chrome and glowing red sensors. It didn't pause to assess the situation. It immediately began firing high-frequency cutting lasers at the nearest support pillar. "Go," Vora commanded, popping out from behind the crate to lay down a suppressive fire of blue plasma. "Get to the auxiliary terminal. I'll keep these scrap heaps occupied." Leo scrambled across the deck, staying low as the room filled with the smell of ozone and burnt insulation. He reached the terminal and began frantically plugging his datapad into the Xandarian interface. His hands were sweating, making it hard to grip the holographic sliders. He could hear the relentless clack, clack, clack of more drones entering the bay. Vora was a whirlwind of martial prowess. She wasn't just shooting. She was moving with a brutal kinetic grace, using her massive strength to crush the drones that got too close. But there were dozens of them, and for every one she shattered, 2 more crawled through the breach. Leo's screen flashed green. "I've got the frequency. But Vora, I need a physical handshake with the lead drone. I need to get within 3 meters of that thing." Vora punched a drone's sensor eye into dust before turning to Leo with a look of pure disbelief. "You want to walk up to a harvester drone? You'll be sliced into Terran-sized cubes in seconds." "It's the only way," Leo yelled, his voice cracking. "The short-range burst is the only thing that will bypass their firewall. Cover me." Vora didn't hesitate. She vaulted over a fallen pillar, her powerful legs propelling her across the room. She grabbed Leo mid-air, shielding his smaller body with hers as she skidded toward the lead drone. The heat from her vents was searing now, a localized sun against Leo's side. As they slid to a halt just feet from the towering harvester, the machine's central eye swiveled toward them, the red glow intensifying. A jagged cutting blade extended, aimed directly at Vora's exposed neck. Leo didn't think. He lunged forward, his datapad extended, his eyes locked onto the machine's core. He could feel the cold wind of the blade's movement against his cheek. "Transmitting, now!" The world went white as a massive electromagnetic pulse rippled through the room, throwing Leo and Vora backward into the shadows. The silence that followed the MP was absolute, broken only by the frantic, ragged breathing of 2 survivors. Leo lay flat on his back, his ears ringing with a high-pitched whine that made his skull ache. The red emergency strobes had died, replaced by the ghostly flickering blue of the ship's backup chemical lights. Beside him, Commander Vora was a dark silhouette, her heavy chest heaving as she fought to regain her equilibrium. "Leo?" Her voice was a rasp, stripped of its usual commanding boom. "Still." "Mostly in one piece," Leo groaned, pushing himself up on shaky elbows. He looked toward the breach. The skeletal harvester drones were frozen in place, their many limbs locked in mid-motion like grotesque metallic statues. The lead drone's cutting blade was suspended exactly 4 inches from where Vora's throat had been. The spoof worked. I told their central processor we're a Class 9 biohazard waste tank. According to their logic, if they crack this ship open, they'll contaminate the entire sector. Vora stood up slowly, her iridescent scales dull and flickering as her body struggled to restart its internal cooling. She looked at the frozen machines, then down at the small human who was currently nursing a bruised shoulder. For the first time since he'd boarded the Stellaris, there was no mockery in her eyes. There was something much more dangerous, respect. "You took a gamble, Terran," she said, reaching down to haul him to his feet with a single, effortless tug. "Xandarians don't gamble, we calculate, we overwhelm. But we don't dive headfirst into a harvester's blade with a tablet and a prayer." Leo brushed the soot off his jumpsuit, trying to ignore how close they were standing in the cramped, shadowy space between the crates. "In my defense, the prayer was very brief. And the tablet is cracked." He looked at the screen of his datapad. A spiderweb of fractures obscured the map of the ship. "We're not out of this yet, Commander. The EMP fried the drones, but it also knocked out the internal comms and the gravity stabilizers in this sector. We're cut off from the bridge." Vora checked her pulse rifle. It was dead, the electronics cooked by the surge. She dropped it with a clatter, the sound echoing through the dead hallway. "Then we move on foot. The secondary engineering hub is 3 decks up. If we can manually jumpstart the thrusters, we can shake these parasites off our hull before their backup processors reboot." She turned to lead the way, but stopped, her hand resting on the frame of the shattered door. Her secondary vents were still pulsing, though much slower now, a soft amber glow in the dim light. She looked back at Leo over her shoulder, her golden eyes unblinking. "You know, Leo, when you were staring at me in the mess hall, I thought you were just another soft human fascinated by something more powerful than himself." She took a step toward him, the heat from her skin warming the chilly air of the depressurized room. "But back there, you didn't look at my posterior. You didn't even look at the blade. You looked at the objective." Leo felt a different kind of heat rising in his chest. "I'm a cultural liaison, Vora. My job is to understand. Sometimes to understand something, you have to get close enough to feel the heat." Vora's mouth quirked into that sharp, predatory grin, but this time, she reached out and ran a clawed thumb along his jawline. The touch was surprisingly light, almost a caress, but it carried the weight of a silent promise. "Careful, liaison. If you get too close to a Xandarian son, you might find that you don't want to go back to the shade." Suddenly, a heavy thud vibrated through the floor, not from the drones, but from the ship's own hull. The Stellaris was tilting. The scavenger ship wasn't just harvesting. It was starting to pull the vessel into its maw. "We're out of time," Vora snapped, her soldier persona snapping back into place. "To the maintenance shafts. Move." But as they scrambled into the dark, cramped service tunnels, Leo's cracked datapad let out a mournful beep. A new signature was appearing on the long-range scanners, something much larger than the scavenger ship, and it was moving toward them at a speed that defied known physics. The maintenance shaft was a claustrophobic nightmare of hissing pipes and jagged conduits. Leo crawled through the narrow space, the metallic scent of old oil filling his lungs. Directly ahead of him, Vora's powerful frame moved with an agility that shouldn't have been possible for someone her size. In the tight quarters, the glow from her heat vents acted like a biological lantern, casting a flickering ember light against the ribbed walls. "The signature I saw, Vora," Leo panted, his voice echoing in the confined space. It wasn't a ship, at least not a standard one. It was moving at nearly 3% the speed of light within a gravitational well. Nothing we know can do that without liquefying the crew. Vora paused at a junction, her scales brushing against the sensors. She looked back at him, her face shadowed. "There are myths in this sector, Leo. The Xandarian elders speak of the world eaters, automated guardians left behind by a precursor race. If they've sensed the reality collapse caused by the rift, they aren't coming to rescue us. They're coming to cauterize the wound. Leo's blood ran cold. Cauterize, you mean? Destroy the rift and the ships caught in it? Precisely, Vora said, her voice grim. She kicked a stuck hatch, the metal groaning before swinging open into a vertical ladder well. Which means we don't just have to escape the scavengers. We have to get the Stellaris back into warp before the Guardian arrives to turn this entire coordinate into a sun. They began to climb. Every rung of the ladder vibrated with the distant, rhythmic thumping of the scavenger drones rebooting. Leo could feel the pressure change in his ears. The ship was losing its atmospheric integrity. He looked up at Vora, watching the way her muscles rippled with every pull. Despite the impending doom, his mind flashed back to her comment in the training deck. He wasn't just observing her anymore, he was relying on her. And terrifyingly, she was relying on him. They reached the secondary engineering hub, a cavernous room filled with humming capacitors and rotating coolant rings. But they weren't alone. 3 of the scavenger drones had already bypassed the security locks. They were busy stripping the insulation off the primary warp core injectors, their cutting lasers throwing showers of white-hot sparks into the air. "Stay back," Vora hissed, reaching for a heavy-duty plasma torch from a nearby workbench. It wasn't a weapon, but in her hands, it looked like the sword of an ancient god. "Vora, the injectors are live," Leo warned. "If you hit the core while they're cutting, the feedback will vaporize this entire deck. Then give me a distraction, Terran," she barked, charging forward into the fray. Leo looked around wildly. His datapad was cracked, his weapons were non-existent, and he was facing ancient killing machines. Then, he saw the coolant release valve. It was a manual override, designed for emergency fire suppression. If he could flood the room with liquid nitrogen, he could freeze the drone's sensors and potentially Leo's own lungs. He lunged for the lever. Behind him, he heard the roar of the plasma torch and the screech of metal. Vora was a blur of violence, slamming her shoulder into a drone, her scales glowing white-hot as she pushed her body to its absolute physical limit. "Leo!" "Now!" she screamed. He pulled the lever. A wall of sub-zero mist exploded into the room. The temperature plummeted instantly. Leo felt the moisture on his eyeballs begin to freeze. The drones hissed, their internal processors seizing up as the extreme cold shattered their ceramic components. Through the fog, Leo saw Vora. She was kneeling, her breath coming out in thick plumes of frost. Xandarians were cold-blooded in the traditional sense. They needed external heat or internal exertion to stay mobile. The nitrogen was killing her faster than it was killing the drones. He scrambled toward her, his own limbs stiffening. He reached her just as she began to slump against the warp core housing. Her skin, usually so warm, was becoming dangerously cool to the touch. "Vora, stay with me," Leo shouted, wrapping his arms around her, trying to share his body heat. She looked at him, her golden eyes dimming, her pupils dilating. She reached up, a trembling hand grasping his collar. The core," she whispered. "Initialize." The jump, but as Leo reached for the control panel, the entire ship shuddered with a force 10 times stronger than before. A deep, resonant hum of sound that felt like it was being played on the fabric of space itself filled the room. The Guardian had arrived. The sound wasn't heard, it was felt. It was a low-frequency vibration that rattled Leo's teeth and made the liquid nitrogen mist dance in geometric patterns on the floor. On the secondary viewing screen, a sliver of the Guardian became visible. It wasn't a ship of bolts and plates. It was a monolithic shard of obsidian dark matter, surrounded by a halo of distorted light. It was beautiful, indifferent, and currently aiming a beam of pure gravitational energy at the scavenger vessel latched onto their hull. "Vora, wake up!" Leo yelled, his voice muffled by the frost-thick air. He squeezed her tighter, ignoring the fact that her scales were starting to feel like jagged ice. He could feel the tiny pulse of her heat vents against his chest. They were fading, a dim ember in a blizzard. He knew the science. Xandarian biology was a high-stakes trade-off. They were gods of kinetic energy, but once they hit their thermal floor, their systems shut down to protect the brain. He had to jump-start her. He had to be the heat source. Leo didn't hesitate. He pulled the emergency thermal blanket from his tactical belt, a thin, foil-like sheet, and wrapped it around both of them, sealing their bodies together. He pressed his face against hers, breathing his warm Terran air directly into her path. "Come on, Vora. You wanted to see what makes me tick. This is it. Stubbornness. It's a human specialty." Slowly, the amber glow in her vents flickered. A spark, then another. Vora's eyes snapped open, a shock of brilliant gold returning to her iris. She gasped, a jagged, freezing intake of breath, and her hands instinctively clamped onto Leo's arms with enough force to bruise. "The Guardian," she rasped, her body beginning to shudder violently as her metabolism kicked back into high gear. It's firing." Outside, the scavenger ship didn't explode. It simply ceased to be. The Guardian's beam hit the metal, and the atoms were stripped away, compressed into a single point of infinite density. The Stellaris groaned as the docking clamps were ripped out of its hull, leaving gaping wounds in the outer skin. "We have 30 seconds before it targets us." Leo scrambled to the console, his fingers numb but determined. "The warp core injectors are clear, but the alignment is manual. I can't do it from here. Someone has to hold the magnetic seal in place from inside the radiation baffle." Vora stood up, her scales flushing a deep, angry crimson as she forced her body to overheat. She looked at the baffle, a narrow, lead-lined tube that led directly into the heart of the engine. "If I go in there, the radiation will scar my scales for life. I'll never be iridescent again." She looked at Leo, then at the view screen where the Guardian's light was beginning to shift toward them. "Do it, Leo," she said, her voice steady and devoid of fear. "I'd rather be a scarred warrior than a shimmering corpse. Start the sequence. When I give the signal, throw the switch." She didn't wait for his protest. She dove into the baffle, her massive strength, the only thing capable of holding the vibrating magnetic rings in alignment against the pull of the Guardian's gravity well. Leo watched the monitors, his heart in his throat. He saw her heat signature spike, not from exertion this time, but from the raw energy of the core. He saw the magnetic levels stabilize. "Now, Leo, do it now." Leo slammed his fist onto the engage icon. The Stellaris screamed as the warp field folded around them, but just as the space began to warp, a final, terrifying message flashed on Leo's cracked datapad. The Guardian hadn't just fired at the ship, it had tagged them with a subspatial anchor. They weren't escaping. They were taking the Guardian with them. The transition to warp wasn't the smooth, silent slide into hyperspace Leo had practiced in simulators. It was a violent, bone-crunching wrench. Because of the Guardian's subspatial anchor, the Stellaris felt like it was being pulled in two directions at once, forward into the warp fold and backward into the crushing grip of the obsidian monolith. The ship screamed, a metallic shriek of overstressed bulkheads that made Leo's ears bleed. "Vora, get out of there!" Leo screamed, lunging toward the radiation baffle. The heavy lead door hissed open, and Vora tumbled out. She didn't fall, she collapsed. Her iridescent scales, once the pride of her lineage, were now scorched and blackened in long, jagged streaks where the magnetic feedback had licked against her skin. She was smoking, her primary heat vents glowing a dangerous, blinding white. "The anchor," she gasped, clutching the deck plating, her claws leaving deep furrows in the metal. "It's dragging us back. We're going to stall." In the fold. If they stalled in the warp fold, they wouldn't just explode. They would be smeared across the fourth dimension, an eternal smear of atoms. Leo looked at his datapad, the screen barely legible through the cracks. The Guardian's anchor was a tether of pure gravitons, linked to the Stellaris' aft sensor array. "I have to cut it," Leo said, a strange, calm clarity washing over him. The manual release for the sensor array is on the outer hull's maintenance catwalk. Vora reached out, her scorched hand shaking as she grabbed his ankle. No, the pressure, the radiation. You're human, Leo. Your skin will boil before you reach the lever. Then it's a good thing I've been studying how you regulate heat, isn't it? Leo reached for the emergency fire suppression suit. A heavy, cumbersome thing, but the only thing that might give him 30 seconds in the localized inferno. He looked at Vora, his heart breaking at the sight of her blackened scales. You held the line for me. It's my turn to hold it for you. He didn't give her a chance to argue. He slammed the helmet into place and cycled the airlock. The moment the outer door opened, the roar of the warp fold hit him. It wasn't sound, it was the raw noise of reality being torn apart. Purple and gold lightning arched across the hull. Leo crawled onto the catwalk, the magnetic boots the only thing keeping him from being swept into the void. The heat was astronomical. He could feel his suit's cooling systems failing instantly. He looked back. The Guardian was a terrifying shadow in the wake of their ship, a dark god refusing to let go of its prey. The tether was a shimmering cord of black light, vibrating with enough energy to power a planet. Leo reached the manual override. It was glowing red. He grabbed the handle, and even through the reinforced gloves, he heard his own skin sizzle. He roared in pain, a sound lost to the vacuum, and threw his entire body weight against the lever. It didn't budge. Come on, he screamed at the universe. We aren't just salvage. He thought of Vora. He thought of her staring him down in the mess hall, her sharp-toothed grin, the way she had shielded him from the drones. He felt a surge of adrenaline, that frantic, irrational human second wind that aliens found so terrifying. With a final, desperate heave, he heard the clack of the release. The sensor array blew away from the ship like a gunshot. The tether snapped. The Stellaris surged forward, free from the anchor, disappearing into the safety of the warp stream. But as Leo tried to crawl back to the airlock, the ship gave one last violent lurch. His magnetic boots flickered. He felt himself lift off the catwalk. He reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of the airlock frame, but he was slipping. He was falling into the purple light of the fold. Then, a massive scorched hand shot out from the airlock and caught him by the wrist. The grip on Leo's wrist was like a vise of heated iron. Even through the layers of his suit, he could feel the raw, desperate strength of the woman holding him. Vora's blackened arm was a stark contrast against the swirling violet chaos of the warp fold behind him. With one agonizing heave, she wrenched him back into the airlock, slamming the manual override shut as the seals hissed into place. The room plunged into silence as the pressure equalized. Leo collapsed onto the deck, his lungs burning, his hands shaking so violently he couldn't even unlatch his helmet. Vora sat slumped against the opposite wall, her breathing ragged, her scorched scales dull in the flickering emergency light. For a long time neither of them spoke. They just listened to the steady, rhythmic hum of the engines, the sound of a ship that was finally truly safe. You're an idiot, Leo, Vora finally rasped, her voice cracking. She reached over, her movements slow and painful, and helped him pull his helmet off. Leo gasped in the recycled air, his face drenched in sweat. He looked at her, his eyes tracing the jagged dark scars that now marked her iridescent skin. I learned it from you. Leading by example and all that. Vora looked down at her hands, at the loss of the shimmering beauty that had been her pride. A small, sad smile touched her lips. I suppose I won't be drawing many stares in the mess hall anymore. I look like a piece of overcooked charcoal. Leo reached out, his fingers hovering over her hand before he gently covered it with his own. You're wrong, Vora. Before, people stared because you were a commander. Because you were powerful. Now, he met her golden eyes, which were still as bright and fierce as the day they met. They'll stare because you're the woman who held a warp core together with her bare hands. They'll stare because you're a hero, and personally, I think the scars look a lot more interesting than the scales ever did. Vora's secondary vents let out a soft, Warm pulse, not a surge of combat heat, but a gentle, steady glow that filled the small room with a sense of peace. She leaned her head back against the bulkhead, her fingers intertwining with his. "I think," she whispered, "I might have to revise my report on Terrans. You aren't just observant. You're persistent." 2 days later, the Stellaris docked at the Federation hub. The story of the staring human and the scorched commander had already spread through the fleet. When Leo and Vora walked down the gangplank together, Leo with his bandaged hands and Vora with her new, dark markings, the entire docking bay went silent. But this time, Leo didn't look at his datapad. He didn't look at the ranks or the vents. He kept his head held high, walking alongside the woman who had become his greatest study in courage. He realized then that humanity's greatest gift to the galaxy wasn't coffee or humor. It was the ability to look into the dark and refuse to blink. I really hope you enjoyed this journey through the stars with Leo and Vora. If you want to see more high-stakes HFY tailies and explore the outer reaches of the galaxy with me, make sure to like this video and share it with your fellow sci-fi fans. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe to HFY Soundscape and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.